Some years ago, I used to teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I taught a course called Becoming American. And in that class, we talked mostly about immigrants to the United States because, except for the Native Americans, that is the Native American Indians, everybody's an immigrant. And let me just put a star there and come back to definition of immigrant. But I also included Southerners, because in many ways I discovered that my students in North Carolina often felt kind of like second-class Americans. Any of you ever had that feeling that you're not quite considered 100% Americans because you're Southern? Put your hand up high if you ever, yeah, so some of you do, a lot of you don't, but some of you know what I'm talking about. And I remember one student said that she had worked real hard to erase her accent when she went north, because if she talked Southern, people treated her like she was stupid. And in American history, often the generalizations about the United States are contradicted in the history of the American South. So, for instance, America is the land of liberty. Well, what about the Confederacy and slavery? American society is economically dynamic, but it turns out that for most of the period until the Second World War, the American South was a place that was not dynamic economically, that it was very much divided between a few really rich people and a whole lot of poor people, and some of those poor people were getting poorer by the decade. America was a place of individuals, whereas in Southern society, in many places, people feel very involved with their families and their communities. America is a secular society. Many Southerners feel very involved with religion, which is a very important part of their lives. So a lot of those generalizations just didn't hold up when you talked about Southerners or people who had strong Southern background. There also was the assumption that if you were a black Southerner, you were dirt poor and ignorant, and if you were a white Southerner, you may not be dirt poor, but you were a stone racist. So that assumption also was prevailing. I don't know if people still feel that way. When we do questions and answers, I'd like to hear from you if you feel that those generalizations are still holding about the South and about Southerners. Now, there was a kind of watershed in the mid-1960s in what it meant to be an American. Before the mid-1960s, if you said, what do you think of when you think of an American? Probably most people would conjure up a mental image of a white person, probably a man, and not a Southerner. And then in the 1960s, things got all shaken up. One big important thing for the American South was a civil rights movement. Another thing that we are now feeling all over the country is that immigration laws changed. And so the immigration since the mid-1960s is reshaping the United States population. So for instance, in the census of 2000, we discovered that you didn't have to just be of one race, for instance. You could be of one or more races. And in the census of 2010, there's a dual system. One is race, which is the more familiar one. And that's black, white, Asian, Native American, Hawaiian, I think that's the 5. And then there's ethnicity. And so everybody has both of those. So I would say my race is black and my ethnicity is non-Hispanic. So ethnicity is Hispanic or not Hispanic. So we have white people who are non-Hispanics, and then we have white people who are Hispanics. And then we have black people who are non-Hispanic, and we have black people who are Hispanic. And so all of that goes, so it means it's a really complicated system. And when you add in that for Latinos or Hispanics, the most popular designation, racial designation, is none of the above. So our system of classifying what it means to be an American is in total disarray. It changes every 10 years, and it's becoming bigger and bigger and more complicated. So you're going to see what it means to be an American in the sense of the way we usually figure it out statistically. You're going to see that change radically or even go to an entirely different system. If I had my way, we would ask questions about class. We would ask about income, and we would ask about wealth. And our public policies would be made on the basis of income and wealth, as well as where you are. So I live in Newark, New Jersey. And my city is now majority African American. Let's go back to immigrants. Because immigrants today are remaking those racial categories. Because some of the black people in Newark are immigrants. So they're people from Ghana, a lot of people from Haiti. The older streams are people from the Caribbean, the West Indies. But nowadays, there are more voluntary immigrants from Africa than there ever were involuntary immigrants from Africa. And those people were largely brought in the 18th century. The big peak is 1740 to 1760, 1770, around there. So less than 500,000 people. There are now more than 500,000 African immigrants in the United States, people who came for the usual reasons of more opportunity. Now, the definition of immigrant. Is someone an immigrant if they were brought against their will? Is someone an immigrant if they were brought against their will? I would now say yes, because so much applies to immigrants no matter how they came. So there's the whole question of language. There's the question of family. Your families are usually broken. Whether you can put them back together or not is questionable. But the other issue of involuntary servitude or poorly paid wage labor. And it turns out that even though American historians kind of draw a line between slavery on one side and poorly paid labor on the other, there's so many places in this second side in which people have come with burdens of debt that they can't work off, and they end up in involuntary servitude, or they don't get paid. So, you know, there's some movement back and forth between the people who were supposedly voluntary immigrants and the way that they get paid. There's a little bit of fudging on the slavery side, but that was a little more rigid. But for me, immigrants who were voluntary and immigrants who were involuntary, I count them all as immigrants. This is not the usual assumption, because usually American historians draw a very sharp line between voluntary immigrants and involuntary immigrants. So becoming American, in this country in which racial designation is so important, and the one that really counts is black. So what is white is kind of the leavings of not black. And people have been going to court for years, for decades, for centuries, to prove themselves white, and it's very hard to do because there's no agreement on what that means. Those definitions are state by state, and they change over time. So for instance, in Virginia, in the 19th century, it was something like 1/16. If you had one of 16 great-grandparents, then you were considered black, but if you had less, then you could be considered white. And then in the 20th century, that changed to 1/32nd, which is why people talk about the one-drop rule. Now, how you count up your ancestors and your drops is always a really intriguing question, and it depends on who your judge is and who your lawyer is. So people are still going to court to try to make themselves white. And it's hard to do, unless you just have sex. Okay, so you want to become white, have sex. Have sex with somebody of another race. I mean, it doesn't always work out. Sometimes if you have sex with, say, somebody who's not white, it doesn't help. But if you have sex and your kids have sex, that kind of takes care of it.
So that wouldn't work for me then?
It will.
Okay, all right.
It will. So sometimes you see pictures of, like, Whoopi Goldberg, I think, and you see Whoopi Goldberg, and then you see her daughter, and her daughter's lighter, and then you see her grandchild, and her grandchild's way lighter. So, sex.
But do you think that sometimes the question may also come into effect how you self-identify yourself?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the troublesome issues of who is an American is that there's so many ways of being an American. They're just, you know, I've talked about the census and, you know, how many categories we have, but how do you decide? Well, you could say, well, do you have an American passport? That's a basic way. But there are a lot of people who have American passports who don't feel like they're really Americans or 100% Americans. And maybe that's because they spend most of their time outside the country, or they don't speak the language. You know, there are a lot of reasons. So having a passport is one thing. But also feeling like 100% American. In the olden days, you had to be a white person for that. But since the 60s, since the erosion of racial segregation and the emergence of people who are comfortable or even very rich, who are brown-skinned. In New Jersey, there are a lot of South Asians, and this is a group whose immigrants are usually pretty well educated. And then there are African Americans who are middle class, or even very, very rich. A few very, very rich African Americans. And then there's our president, who's an African American. He's not very rich, but he's pretty powerful. And in the olden days, in the 20th century, power and African Americanness didn't go together. Sometimes they do now. But so there are lots and lots and lots of ways to be an American. We have a lot of policing going on to try to pretend that we can keep people in boxes. So I remember talking to students who would say that if they're white and they have black friends, some of their friends would try to get them back in line to be a better kind of white person. Or black students who had white friends and their other friends would try to get them in line to be a better kind of black person. And some of the anxiety in rap music from like the 80s was about trying to decide what a black person was like. So identifying yourself as an American can sometimes be kind of a job, actually. Now, here in Eastern Kentucky, I'm pretty sure you don't go around thinking, gosh, I wonder if people are considering me a real American. That's not a problem here, is it? No. Everybody's pretty certain about that. Is everybody pretty certain about that? Yeah? 100%?
Let me see. How many hands say yeah?
We are certain.
Yeah,
Certain.
not a problem.
How many said no?
Oh, we have a few no's. They're all grown-ups, but
Okay.
they're all grown-ups. Okay. Well, that settles it.
Doesn't settle it just yet. Anyone have a question? One question?
I have a question. I'd be so interested in hearing your thoughts about the Tea Party.
Everything I know about the Tea Party, I read in the Star Ledger, which is the New Jersey paper, or the New York Times. And I have a neighbor whose bumper sticker says, "Don't believe what you read in the liberal media." Don't believe the liberal media. I believe the liberal media. And from what I understand, I'm hoping my neighbor isn't one of them. From what I understand, the Tea Party, well, I understand the Tea Party is very heterogeneous. And so there, it's a movement. It doesn't have like membership cards, and you don't go through a process to learn how to be a good Tea Party person. You just say, "I'm Tea Party," and you could say that, and I could say that, and you could say that. And then when it came down to actually agreeing on something like, should my governor Chris Christie run for president, we might all disagree. You know who I'm talking about, Governor Chris Christie, when I said, should he? Yeah. So we might all disagree. So it's a heterogeneous movement. However, it seems to be opposed to 100% of what I believe. It seems not to believe in evolution. It seems not to believe in government activity. And if that had been the case years ago, we would not have an internet, for instance, because the internet was developed by the Department of Defense, actually, but very much a government. I had a class at the Rhode Island School of Design a couple of years ago called Digital Tools for Artists. And I had an argument with one of the students about access